morning. Am I on here? Thank you, Ben. Nice to be here. I've been looking forward to come and speaking to you people again. I can't remember when I was here last. Seems like only a few months ago, but it could have been longer than that. Thank you for your welcome, Bruce. Bruce, thank you. And Colin, for your prayer. And look forward to what we're going to study about today. I'm going to try and carefully time my service today. Now, in fielding, we have a fairly strict rule with our speakers, and you have to do your service within about half an hour. Now, if you go longer than that, you probably won't get asked to come back. That's our gentle way of saying you have to not speak for too long. And so I've, over the years, trained myself to speak within about half an hour. And so today I've got my service in three parts. The other week, a minister came and took a visiting speaker, and he said, I've got 7 points to cover. And so you're looking at the clock, and he's up to number 3, and it's 10 to 12, and you think, we've got a long way to go. Unfortunately, his last 4 points were not all that long. I've got three parts to my sermon today, and the first part is the longest. So if we get to sort of 20 minutes, don't worry, the last 2 are shorter. I have preached this service before, hopefully not here. I don't keep notes, at least not very good notes, and so I'm not sure whether I have. But it's a regenerated service, and so much of it is new. I know Pastor Anton also has preached a service very like mine, and I thought, he's copied my service. We'll probably just read the same books. And maybe Pastor Anton has taken this service. But today's service starts off with the story of David. David would have to be perhaps one of the most important, perhaps the most important character in Scripture. And I say that because 60 chapters of the Bible are devoted to David. Now, excluding Jesus, he is the most talked about by the next character in the Bible that comes closest to that is 30 chapters. So David has twice as many chapters about him than any other character excluding Jesus in the Bible. I'm going to start the story of David today, 1 Samuel chapter 16. Saul has been rejected by the Lord because of his disobedience and his refusal to follow what God had told him to do. Saul hadn't always been like that. Saul actually was king for 40 years in Israel, and he lived to about 70 years old. A very strong man. And as you recall the story of Saul, he was actually killed in battle. Imagine fighting when you were 70 years old. He was still a very vibrant man. But the Lord had left him long before that. And so the Lord said to Samuel, I want you to get down there to Bethlehem. There's a family down there I want you to visit. And one of the boys in this family, there are 8 of them, and I want you to choose a king out of one of them, and I'll show you which one it is. Now, Samuel was reluctant to do that because Samuel lived up in Hebron, and Saul lived in Gilead, and Jesse's house was down in Bethlehem, and Samuel had to go through Gilead past Saul, and he was a bit frightened of Saul because Saul was no longer a God-fearing man. He was afeared that if he knew he was on his way to anoint another king, he may very well kill him. And the Lord said, no, take a sacrifice with you and just tell Saul if he asks, you're on your way to sacrifice, and that's what he did. Got down to Jesse's house and said, Jesse, I need all your boys here. The Lord's got a special message for you, for your family, for your boys. And as Samuel sat there looking at the 7 boys that were there, he picked out the king immediately. Eliab, the oldest one, tall, good-looking, strong man. He undoubtedly was the king. And the Lord said to Samuel, men tend to look at a man's looks and his height, but I look at a man's heart, and I have rejected him. Okay, maybe it's another one. There were 6 other good-looking, strong, kingly-looking boys there, and the Lord rejected all of them. And Samuel was confused. He said to Jesse, is this all your sons? No, there's one more out in the field, just a young one. but we didn't bother bringing him in because he's only a young boy. And Samuel said, we won't go any further until your youngest son is brought in. And as soon as young David arrived, probably about 17 at this age, maybe a little bit younger, the Lord said he is the one, and in front of his brothers and his father he was anointed as the future king. What happened to David after that? He now knew he was going to be king one day. Well, he just went back out into the fields and continued to be a shepherd. It wasn't long after this that Saul seemed to have trouble with, might be demon possession. We learned about that in the Sabbath school lesson today. But an evil spirit would come upon him, and he would suffer perhaps some sort of depression, some sort of bad feeling that would come over him. And his people that were in his palace said, look, you need somebody to play sweet music that might help to dispel the black feeling that comes over you. And someone said, I know someone down there in Bethlehem. He writes his own music and he sings his own songs and he plays his own instrument. David from Jesse's house. And so they brought him in, and it worked. When David would play his music, sing his songs, the evil spirit would leave Saul. He didn't stay at Saul's palace. He only came down sometimes, and then he would go back to his work in the fields. The Philistines and the Israelites were always fighting. And a war came between the two of them again. The two armies camped either side of the valley. And you know the story well. Their champion was Goliath from Gath. And Goliath would come out every day for 40 days. He would abuse the God of Israel. He would make fun of him. He would taunt them to come out and fight him. Now, the obvious man to come out and fight would be Saul. He was a big man. He was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was an experienced soldier. Nobody was brave enough to come out and fight him. David had been sent down by his father Jesse. 3 of the oldest boys were in the army, and they were there, say fighting, but no fighting was taking place. And while David was there taking food to his brothers, this giant came out, as he did every day, cursing and swearing and abusing the God of Israel and taunting them to come down and fight him. And David was amazed. Is no one going to stand up to this blasphemer? Word got back to Saul that someone was talking like this. And Saul said, send him to me. And here comes his harp player, his singer. And says to David, you're not a soldier, you're too young to fight this man. And David gave him his experiences of how he had fought the lion and the bear and killed them when they came to take his lambs. And so Saul, I suppose somewhat reluctantly, said, okay, you can go and fight him. He knew what the result would be. Give it a go. David was a master marksman with a slingshot. Now, I always used to think the slingshot was a bit like a Shanghai. You know, Shanghais we used to make when we were kids, you know, a bit of a rubber tubing and a fork stick and a bit of a stone on the end, and that was our Shanghai. It never used to go very far and certainly wasn't very accurate. But a slingshot's quite different. You swing it around like this, you know, round and round. And we, you know, the story goes that he went down and picked up some little stones out of the... no, actually, they were quite big stones. They were about a pound. So the sort of baseball size, perhaps even bigger, apple size stones. And men got very accurate with these slingshots. You can go back to the book of Judges, and in the tribe of Benjamin, they had 700 men in the Benjamite army that were all left-handed. And they all could use a slingshot and hit their mark within a hair's breadth, the Bible tells us. Now, that's quite good, isn't it? Even with a rifle with a telescopic sight, if you could get within a hair's breadth, you'd think you're pretty good. Well, these guys could do this with their slingshot, and they could sling those stones about 100 miles per hour. They reckon you can do that. And so if you were good with a slingshot, you could do quite a bit of damage. And this is what David was using. And we know he hit Goliath in the head, knocked him down, cut off his head, and a great defeat happened to the Philistines that day. When the army returned with David after that great battle, the woman came out singing a song which gave some praise to Saul. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000. Of course, a gross exaggeration. But nonetheless, jealousy crept into the evil heart of Saul. And even though David had fought a good battle and done a great favour for him, his heart was turning against David. On 2 occasions after that, we know Saul tried to kill him by throwing a javelin at him and nailing him against the wall. Twice he missed. And David knew that he could not stay there much longer. However, David's daughter, Michal, she fell in love with David. Why wouldn't she? Think of all the things that David could do. We know he was a good-looking man. We know he was a very strong man. He was an excellent shot with a slingshot. He was a great soldier. He was a great leader of men. He was a deeply spiritual man. He was a musician who could sing, write and play music. Now guys, how many of you would like to be like that? Young ladies, older ladies, any of us, remember back to your romancing days? Was that the sort of man that would have been attractive to you? Ladies? Guys, was that the sort of man you would have liked to have been? This was the sort of man that David was. And the king's daughter fell in love with him. And Saul said, very well, this is a great trap. Very well, David, and he gave him a very gross sort of project to do. Go and get 100 foreskins of the Philistines, and when you've brought those trophies back, you can have my daughter. Of course, Saul was hoping he would get killed. There's only one way you could get that sort of trophy, and that was to kill the man. David did that and brought 200 back, and Saul had no option but to give his daughter to David. But things went from bad to worse, and finally David had to leave. And for the next probably 10, 12 years, David lived as a nomad in the wilderness. And there were many interesting experiences that happened during those 12 years. And David's a big story. We won't go into them today. But after 30 years, Saul was killed in battle, along with Jonathan and 2 other of his sons. And David could have thought that he was now safe. He could now be king of all Israel, but not so. He waited on the Lord and said, Lord, where shall I go? And he said, you go down to Hebron and you can be a king of a small area, just of the tribe of Judah. And it says for the next 7.5 years, the house of Saul and the house of David, Saul was gone, but there were still relatives who thought they could be king. They fought with each other, and gradually David became stronger. And eventually, after 7.5 years, David became king of all Israel. And he immediately began to put things right in Israel. He began to push the Moabites back. Remember, David was part Moab. Remember, his great-grandmother was a Moabitess, Ruth. However, he didn't consider himself a Moabite. He considered them his enemy. And he pushed the Moabites back. He pushed the Amalekites back. The Edomites, they too were related. And they thought, this king's becoming too strong. They came up and battled again, and he pushed them back. He extended the territories of Israel by 10 times the amount that it had been. He became a powerful king in the Middle Eastern area. He built himself a palace. He fortified Jerusalem, became the capital city. And during this time, finally there became a peace and prosperity in Israel. And one day he was sitting in his palace, and he was thinking of how all the trauma in his life, and suddenly a period of peace and tranquility had entered his life. And 2 things he thought he might do. He'd build a house for God. God said, no, you won't build a house for me. You've killed too many men. You've got too much blood on your hand. I don't want you to do that. Another day he was thinking, I wish my old friend Jonathan was here. I'd love him to be here. They were the deepest of friends. And then he remembered Jonathan had made a request of him one time. David, I know you're going to be king one day, and when you are king, could you please look after my family? David swore that he would. And up until that point, he had forgotten about it. He called his servants in. He said, I've got a promise I have to keep. Is there any of the house of Saul left? They went out and they found that there was an old servant of Saul's. He had done very nicely for himself because there wasn't any of Saul's household left really, but there was a lot of Saul's land left. And Ziba had set himself up on Saul's land and was living a very prosperous life. He had multitudes of sons and servants. And so David called Ziba in and said, is there any of Saul's family left? He said, yes, there is one, but he is lame in both feet. His name is Mephibosheth. Why did he mention he's lame in both feet? Essentially what Ziba was saying is, David, he's not a threat to you. You see, the practice in Eastern kingdoms those days was when one line of king was deposed and a new line came in, all those descendants would be killed because they would have some claim to the throne. David, of course, hadn't bothered to do that, and Ziba thought this was what he might be up to, and he said, don't worry about him, David, he's crippled in both legs. We know how he became crippled in both legs because when Saul's house fell, the nurse that was holding the little baby, his name was Mephibosheth, dropped him and he damaged both his legs, and that's why he was crippled. But Ziba went on and said, and David said to him, so where does Mephibosheth live? Oh, he lives way up there by the desert in a place called Lo-debar. Now David knew that place because David lived in the desert for 10 years, 10 plus years. Lo-debar in Hebrew means no pasture, i.e. desert, hard living, cattle don't grow very well out in that place. David said, send for the man, I need Mephibosheth to come to the palace. So they sent out for him, sent some men out, and that was quite away from Jerusalem to Lo-debar on the other side of the Jordan. And they had to take, they knew he was crippled, and so they had to take horses or a cart to bring him back in. They knocked on Mephibosheth's door. They went and found out where he was, and his wife came to the door. Mephibosheth had now grown up, married, and actually had a son called Micah. And his wife came to the door and opened the door, and she saw the soldiers standing there, and suddenly her heart sunk. They knew this day probably would come, where the king would come for one of Saul's descendants. And Mephibosheth on his crutches holds to the door and says, I'm the man you're looking for. The king wants to see you. And so they take him, and they take him back to Jerusalem. And Mephibosheth just wonders, is this my last day? Am I going to survive this? He goes back through country that he's never seen before. He's never been to Jerusalem before because that's not where his grandfather's palace was. It was back in Hebron. Gilead, sorry. And he was amazed at this beautiful city that had been built. He's taken into the presence of the king, and he falls down flat on his face, and he prostrates himself, and he says, I'm just a dog, King David. I'm a nobody. You don't have to worry about me. And he looks up into the face of David, and David says, look up, stand up. You don't need to be there on the ground. And he sees what is called a yes face on the face of David. And instead of seeing a stern king, revengeful king, he sees a yes face, and his heart lifts a little bit. What do I mean by a yes face? Sometimes you'll go into a store, and there are some, in Palmerston North, we have a Bunnings. Probably don't have a Bunnings here. Do you have a Bunnings here? No Bunnings. And there are staff everywhere. And they're all busy, very busy, stacking shelves in conversation with somebody else, and you need help. But they're all very busy doing something else, and so you're looking around for someone who might be sympathetic to your cause. There's a story told of Thomas Jefferson, American president. He was riding across country one day, and a group of men were riding across. It had been raining, and they came to a stream that they had to ford. And waiting beside the stream was a wayfaring stranger that was just on foot. And he was waiting there because it was too deep for him to cross. He didn't want to get his clothes wet. And the horseman began to cross the stream, the swollen stream as it was. And about halfway through, he looked up to one of the men and he said, "Would you mind if I hopped on the back of your horse and went across the stream with you?" "Sure," said the man. Picked him a hand, pulled him up, hopped on the back of the horse, took him across the stream. When he got to the other side, he just dismounted and began walking. And another of the party came up to him and they said, "Excuse me, sir, why did you ask the President of the United States for a ride?" "I did not know it was the President of the United States." He said, "I just saw a yes face, and so I asked him." We need to show our yes faces sometimes, don't we? When people are looking for things, people need help. Mephibosheth saw a yes face. And David said, "Stand up." He said, "For the sake of your father, who was my deepest friend, I'm going to restore you to what you used to be." He already had a robe there waited for him, and he said, "Take off your old dusty robe. I'm going to give you this new robe." And as he put the new robe around him, it covered up all his defects and his dustiness and his dirt. And David said to him, "And now you're going to live at my place, and you're going to be like a son to me. From now on, I want you to eat with me." And so that night they had a banquet, and everybody was invited, everybody that was somebody. And David decided at the feast that he would be the first there, and he sat on the chair up the head of the table, and it was a long table. And sitting beside him was the queen for the day. Now remember, David had multiple wives, and so it could have been any one of a number of women that were the queen for the day, sitting beside, and she was looking beautiful. And then there was a space beside David on his right-hand side, and then he saw one of his other good friends, Joab. He came in. I think of Joab as being a man with a bald head for some reason. Not particularly big, but a stocky man. Sunburnt by the years that he spent outside. Somewhat steely grey eyes. He was a crafty man, but he was a very close friend to David, but not a man to be crossed. And then there was Absalom. Oh, the crowds were around Absalom. Beautiful Absalom, the most handsome man with an amazing long hair. And all the people crowding around Absalom as he came into the banquet room. And his beautiful sister Tamar, that he kept a very close eye on. And then there were others there. The eldest son of David came in, and a few other friends, and they sat down. But they couldn't start because there was still one seat that was vacant. And they waited, and they heard him before they saw him, because they heard the clomp, clomp, clomp of wooden crutches on the stone floor. And Mephibosheth comes round the corner with a servant leading him, and he's embarrassed. He had hoped to slip into a seat at the bottom end of the table closest to the door. And everyone stopped talking as they watched this new member of the family as he clomped his way. David stands up and says, "Mephibosheth, up here, you sit right beside me." And as he goes up beside where the seat that is allocated for him, the servants pull the chair out and ease him in. They take away the embarrassing crutches and hide them behind a curtain somewhere. And the tablecloth with its long tassels on the table there falls down over his handicapped feet, and he looks like all other royalty there. And the spiritual implications of that story are obvious. He was born into royalty. He was one of the princes. But very early in his life, he lost that royal standing, just like us as humans. We were born into royalty. We were sons and daughters of God, perfect in the way that we have been made. And God communed with them every day. But quite early in human history, we don't know how long, but it seems like a very short time, man lost that standing, and he no longer could communicate with his Creator. And he was banished to a land called Lo-debar, no pasture. Oh yes, people still had plenty of food, but spiritually it was a land where there was no pasture. and there we all reside. Until one day an invitation... Sorry, is that me doing that? One day an invitation comes to everybody, I believe. Now for some it's stronger than others, but every day everyone has an invitation. The King wants an audience with you in his throne room. Now we can reject that, and we can say, no, I quite like it here in Lodebar. I like this barren place. Surprisingly, most people can make that choice. But for those who make the choice and come into the presence of the King, and we discover that we are nobody, we have nothing to offer the King, but we look up into... Is that me, or is that me making my... It might be me waving my arms around a bit. We look up into the face of the King, and he says, stand up. You don't need to be there. I want to make you royalty again. And he puts his robe of righteousness round about us, and even though we are still dirty, rotten sinners, we look as though we are perfect and royalty in his sight. But he doesn't leave us there. He says, from now on, I want you to dwell in my presence. I want you to live with me. I want you to dine with me. I want you to become and live like a prince or a princess. I want to just change tack here at this point. I'm a 5th generation Seventh-day Adventist. There's a fascinating story on my mum's side. A fascinating story how mum's side of the family became Seventh-day Adventists. Their name was Pascoe. And they lived right down the bottom of the South Island, the bottom eastern corner, sort of level with the bluff, farming down there. And they found a little slip of paper to do with the Sabbath. And they became Sabbath keepers and then became Seventh-day Adventists down the track. That was my great-great-grandfather. He had a son called Will Pascoe, and if any of you go to South Island Big Camp, the name of the camp is Pascoe Park. It's named after my great-great-uncle. I have some grandchildren who are now 7th generation Seventh-day Adventists. Now, the only reason I'm telling you this is that I am a true blue Adventist. It's in my blood. I believe in it. I love my church. And the reason I belong to the Seventh-day Adventist Church is because it has more truth than any other church. Now notice how I said that. It has more truth than any other church. I didn't say it has all of the truth. Now some of you might want to throw stones at me when I get outside later. But there is no other church that has more truth than the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If there was, I would have to go and join it. I baptised a lady about 5 years ago, and she worshipped in a church about 150 metres down the road from our church in Fielding. And she said to me, I loved my church, my Pentecostal church. She said, I love the people, I had good friends there, I love the fellowship, but they didn't keep the Sabbath, and I had to change. That's what I would have to do if I found a church that had more than this one has. What I'm referring to here is that we don't know everything. Do you know everything? Are you perfect in everything that you do, in your behaviour and your knowledge? There is an old heresy that's been around ever since Adam and Eve. And I spoke earlier about Adam and Eve. They sinned, and the first thing they did, or one of the first things they did, is they gathered up fig leaves and decided to cover themselves by their own works to make themselves able to meet with God. They covered their nakedness with fig leaves. An act of works to make yourself right with God. Cain did the same thing. God said, I want you to bring a sacrifice, Cain and Abel. Abel brought a blood sacrifice without the shedding of blood. There is no remission of sins. Cain brought his works offering, fruit that he had grown with his own hands. And so we go down through the ages. We talked about Saul, who decided he would do the sacrifice his way rather than God's way. We get to the intertestament period where the children of Israel were so convinced that they had to follow the law perfectly, they made multitudes of laws over and above God's laws in an effort to try and correct their behaviour and make them acceptable to God. And all they did was make a very tedious, boring, unfulfilling religion which nobody could come up to the standard. We get to Paul's time, and a lot of the new converts were Jews who'd come out of traditional Judaism. Paul taught them the gospel of how to be saved, that it's the works of Christ that will save you. And he says to the Galatians, you foolish Galatians, I was here 18 months ago and I told you the gospel and you've gone back to the old Judaism. We get to the church through the Middle Ages, who distorted the gospel and brought in works, and you could pay for your sins, and a man could forgive your sins, and the gospel was lost sight of. But then great men like Martin Luther and all his contemporaries came forward and rebuilt, renewed, of course it was always there but in a small way, but renewed the great doctrine of righteousness by faith, that we are saved by the righteousness of Christ. However, as time's gone by, those things sneak back in to our church. It's hard for us to accept that someone will give us something for nothing, isn't it? We find that hard. And when God says, I'm going to give you something for nothing, we find that hard. And there's this interesting doctrine that has snuck its way into the Adventist church. In fact, it hasn't snuck its way, it's always been there. But it's been popularised by some people who believe that before Jesus comes, there's going to be a group of people, 144,000 of them, who have stopped sinning, and because they have stopped sinning, God will save them through their own righteousness. Oh yes, their past sins will be forgiven by Jesus' blood, but from that point on to the end of time, they have stopped sinning, therefore they are acceptable to God. It's not true. It's a false gospel. When will we get perfection? Remember, we have to be perfect to be saved. When will we get perfect? We'll get perfect when that robe's put around us. When did Mephibosheth receive his perfection? When he looked into the yes face and accepted David as his new father, accepted his robe around him. Did it change his life? Yes, it did. And that's the same for us. When we accept Jesus' robe of righteousness round about us, we lived in a saved relationship with Jesus. I know people who have become so distressed that their life is not perfect, that they've committed suicide. I know 2 of them. They could not live up to the standard. What a shame. That wasn't what God was requiring of them. All he was requiring was that they be covered with Jesus' righteousness, not their own. My half hour's nearly up, and I'm going to finish on this next point. We as Seventh-day Adventists believe we have a special message to teach, and it's the 3 angels' message, Revelation 14, 6 to 12. And the first angel says, a first angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto every nation, kindred, tongue and people, saying, fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. So there we have the everlasting gospel to preach unto all the world. Couched in the Creator and the Sabbath doctrine. That's why I have to be a Seventh-day Adventist. The gospel is couched, is encompassed by worshipping the Creator God, which is the seventh-day Sabbath. But what is the everlasting gospel? The everlasting gospel is one that has always been. Have you ever come across somebody who finds out you're an Adventist? You Adventist, you believe you're saved by the law. You're in the old dispensation. Ever heard them say that? Nobody has ever been saved by the law. Whether you lived in the Old Testament or the New Testament, no one's ever been saved by the law. And those Adventists who say at the end of time there's going to be a group of people who stop sinning and so therefore they're going to be saved, that's not true either. We are all saved the same way. That is by being covered by Jesus' righteousness. I love the text in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 and 52. It tells us when we receive this perfect righteousness of our own, the one that Adam and Eve had before they fell. And it tells us with a great trumpet call, dead in Christ will rise, this mortal will put on immortality, and this corruptible will put on incorruption when we see Jesus coming in the clouds. Before that time, you will be reliant on the covering of Jesus' righteousness completely 100%. If us, if you, if this church is preaching any other gospel, it's not the everlasting gospel. There is only one gospel. Matthew 24 tells us about the end time events. Wars, famines, earthquakes, pestilences, all sorts of things, false Christs. But this gospel shall go to all the world, and then the end will come. Which gospel? The everlasting gospel. Not the works-based gospel, not any other gospel. The everlasting gospel will go to all the world, and then the end will come. 3 more minutes. An army padre was needing to employ another chaplain, army chaplain. Put an advert in the appropriate places. Number of men and probably women applied. And they put their qualifications and they came in and the senior chaplain looked at them and saw some had degrees and some had good experience and some were counsellors. And he chose a handful of the ones that seemed the most likely prospects. And he interviewed all of them, and at the end of each interview he said, now I want you to tell me, how can I be saved in 3 minutes? Now the reason for him saying that's obvious. If you have a wounded man on the battlefield, he may only have 3 minutes of consciousness left. He needs to be saved. Can you tell him how to be saved in 3 minutes? I thought about that and I thought, that is a challenge, isn't it? We need to know. Let me tell you. First of all, you need to realise you are a sinner. Now, most of us don't have a problem with that. We are, even the best of us, me as a 5th generation Adventist, being a minister for a number of years, know that of myself, I've got nothing to offer to God to say, I'll give you 5%. If you just cover me 95%, I'll do the other 5%. Now, I haven't got anything to offer God. I have to repent of my sins and say, Lord, I am sorry that I'm not what I should be. Please forgive me. And he tells us that anybody who asks for forgiveness, he will do it in a moment. That we accept Jesus, who spilt blood for us and will cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Though our sins be as scarlet, he will wash them white as snow. He then says, now, but you need to be perfect to come into my kingdom. I'm going to give you my perfection. And if you will accept that, you'll be right with God right now. Now that is the gospel, and that took less than 3 minutes to tell you this morning. My prayer this morning is that, remember that, how we are to be saved. We can live in the joy of knowing that we walk out of here this morning in the rightness of Jesus Christ, and we're in a right standing with him, and before the eyes of God we look perfect.